Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Annie Booth, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our conversation tonight. I am a curatorial assistant and visitor experience coordinator at the FSU Museum of Fine Arts, and you're joining us for It's a Lot Like Falling in Love, Lesbian Publishing in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and Beyond. So this event is in relationship with MOFA's current exhibition, It's a Lot Like Falling in Love, Legacies of Naiad Press in the Tallahassee Lesbian Community. This is on view at the museum in Tallahassee for anyone who's local or who wants to make the trip, and it's on view until October 29th of this month. Just of note, we are using closed captioning for this event. And so if you would like to enable that on your screen, you can adjust it at the menu bar at the bottom of the Zoom menu. We are blown away by the excitement and the support of the event tonight. And I'd just like to thank you all for being here with us. We're going to start with a reading of the museum's land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the Florida State University Museum of Fine Arts is located on the land that is the ancestral and traditional territory of the Appalachian Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. We recognize the impact of historical trauma and dispossession, and also ongoing systemic inequities. We acknowledge the relationships of care that these Indigenous nations continue to maintain with this land. And through this acknowledgement, we celebrate their resilience and strength then and now, and we express our ongoing commitment to dismantle silence histories based on colonialism. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to one of the curators of the exhibition and the originators of the project, Dr. Michael Franklin, Assistant Director of Honors in the Major here at FSU. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Annie. So hello, everybody. My name is Michael David Franklin. I am a faculty member in the honors program at Florida State University. I want to first thank FSU's Museum of Fine Arts for their incredible support of the current exhibition about Naiad Press. Annie just mentioned, called It's a Lot Like Falling in Love, Legacies of Naiad Press in the Tallahassee Lesbian Community. As Annie already shared, the exhibition is up at the museum until October 29th. And if you're not located in the Tallahassee region, but you're interested in looking through the exhibition and listening to some of the oral histories, the digital version linked to in the chat, listed by my colleague Meredith, is one way to get there. The digital exhibition, the version online, will remain up beyond October 29th. And I do know that after today's roundtable, in the email that goes out to everybody with a link to the recording of tonight's discussion, a link to the exhibition will also be recorded. That said, tonight's roundtable discussion would not have been possible without the Museum of Fine Arts support, so thank you again. I also want to thank the Lesbian History Archives for co-sponsoring tonight's roundtable discussion, and to thank FSU's Honors Program and FSU's Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Program for their support. My student collaborator, Rayanne Quick, and I would like to give a little background for tonight before the roundtable discussion begins. Tonight's roundtable comes out of an oral history project I spearheaded at FSU in early 2020 in collaboration with FSU Special Collections. The project is called the LGBT Oral History Project of North Florida, and it is focused on collecting, preserving, and sharing queer and trans oral histories of North Florida by way of collaborations between students in FSU's honors program, FSU colleagues, and community members. So through this project and in a class I teach in the honors program about LGBTQ oral history methods, I met Rayanne. Her interest in regional lesbian histories, and particularly in Naiad Press, had us soon collaborating together to gather oral histories of people who worked for Naiad Press in the 80s and 90s and who were variously involved with Naiad, as well as with women who were part of the Tallahassee lesbian community during these decades. So I now want to hand things over to Rayanne for her to be able to say more about Naiad Press.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rayanne Quick, and I am a current undergraduate student at Florida State University. I want to thank the Museum of Fine Arts for being able to host such an event with these icons in lesbian publishing. And I wanted to give a little background as to what Naiad Press was. So Naiad Press was founded in 1973, and at the time, it was one of the largest lesbian publishing companies in the world. It was founded by Anita Merchant, Muriel Crawford, Barbara Greer, and Donna McBride. This press originally started more as a self-publishing venture, but originally grew to explode with the publication of Lesbian Nuns Breaking Silence in 1985. The company shuttered upon the retirement of Barbara Greer and Donna McBride in 2003, and much of the works moved to Bella Books, which is still located in the Tallahassee area. While our exhibition is notably tied to Naiad Press, it was important for me and the project at large to understand that much of the lesbian history is tied to multicultural and intersectional activism. Lesbian publishing history is intrinsically tied to the works of Black, Indigenous, Chicana, and other lesbians of color. Naiad represents only one example of the vast, impactful work that lesbian publishing did in the late 20th century and today. Kitchen Table Press, BLF Press, Aunt Luke Press, Persephone Press, Firebrand Books, and countless others represent the incredible work of lesbians throughout the 20th century and beyond. And with that, I want to hand it over to our moderator, Julie Enszer.
Hello, everyone. Michael and Rayanne, thank you so much for that framing discussion, but also really for all of your work on this wonderful project, which is so exciting and inspiring. I want to welcome everyone in the Zoom room with us. I will note it's been said in the chat, but also for people who are not monitoring the chat, your video and audio as participants is disabled so that we have enough bandwidth for the whole meeting to move forward. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy. You are able to chat and put questions in the chat or comments and talk amongst yourselves in the chat as well. This is such a wonderful event celebrating the LGBT Oral History Project at North Florida at Florida State University and the wonderful exhibition at the FSU Museum of Fine Arts, which I saw this summer and found just enchanting. As the home of Naiad Press, Inc. for 20 years, Tallahassee, Florida was a hotbed of lesbian publishing and is now being recognized, which is such an extraordinary pleasure. As Rayanne indicated, Naiad's work is part of a larger blossoming of lesbian feminist publishing during this time period, including books, periodicals, broadsides, and more. The publishing work that brought lesbian feminist voices to their communities and to a broader US reading public continues to affect us today. And more of this revolution of words is being recognized. Recently, the building that was the home of Firebrand Books in Ithaca, New York, was designated as a site of historic significance, a wonderful recognition for Firebrand and its founder and publisher, Nancy Bariano. In addition, a new book is coming out about Helene Victoria Press, which published wonderful broadsides and postcards about feminist history. There are many other forms of recognition of lesbian, feminist, and progressive publishing that's happening in multiple locations. And this evening, we'll explore this period of vibrant cultural production with a distinguished group of panelists. Our plan for the evening is to have a roundtable conversation among the women gathered here and then entertain a few questions from the audience. We will wrap up by about 7:15 East Coast time, about 75 minutes after our start time for those of you in other geographical locations. I'm going to begin with a brief one-sentence introduction of our distinguished panelists. Their full biographies are on the Eventbrite site for the few people in the audience for whom these icons are not known. I know that for many of us this evening, these women are rock stars and need no introduction. Yet I will
Yes.
introduce them in the order that they will speak this evening in response to our first question. Then after the first question, we will dispense with formal order and speak as the Spirit moves us. So let me welcome our 5 panelists. First, we will hear from Katherine Forrest. Katherine V. Forrest has published 9 books and edited countless others while she was senior editor at Naiad Press. She has 17 works of fiction in print and translation worldwide, which include the lesbian classics Curious Wine and Daughters of a Coral Dawn, and her 10-volume Kate Delafield mystery series. I'm going to introduce everyone first, and then we'll have them speak. Cheryl Clarke is a Black lesbian feminist poet and author of 6 books of poetry, most recently By My Precise Haircut, as well as critical and life-changing essays on African-American feminist and lesbian literary traditions. Joan Nestle is co-founder of the Lesbian History Archives, an extraordinary author in her own right, and now at 82 years old, she gives thanks and inspiration to all of the life-giving communities of resistance and creation that have touched her life. Stephanie Andrea Allen, PhD, is an interdisciplinary humanities scholar, creative writer, small press publisher of BLF Press, a treasured press of the moment, and assistant professor of gender studies at Indiana University. And Barbara Smith has played a groundbreaking role in opening national, cultural, and political dialogues about the intersections of race, class, sexuality, and gender, including significantly for our purposes tonight as a founder and publisher of Kitchen Table Woman of Color Press. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Katherine, and then I'll call on people and we'll have some opening remarks. And our prompt for the opening remarks really is to tell us about your publishing work and or your scholarly work during this time period. Katherine.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, first of all, to Florida State University and to Michael and Rayanne for just this amazing achievement in framing just the life and work of 2 incredible women, Barbara Greer and Donna McBride, and their creation of Naiad Press. Truly a daughter of Florida, and a total mover and shaker in terms of the history of publishing in our community. And I also want to say, before I say anything else, how greatly honored, privileged, flattered, and amazed that I am to be with this group of women. You are all absolutely my heroes. If we had a Mount Rushmore of lesbians, you 3 would be on it for just what you what you've given to us. Anyway, it's just absolutely wonderful to be in this group.
I look good in rock.
You particularly would. And I'm really happy to provide some context, because not only did I begin publishing, I met Barbara in 1982 at Sisterhood Bookstore in Los Angeles, and I was their senior editor until 1994-95. And I was in daily contact with Barbara Greer, and so I just have a lot of exposure, a lot of context. And the other thing, I've just been so grateful to have this opportunity is you're a part of something, and you do your work. I'm sure that you're kind of all aware of this, and all of a sudden you lift your head and you realize that some great things have been happening. And this Florida State exhibit has just enabled me to look just at the years that I was with Naiad Press, and the extraordinary achievements that went on there. And when I met Barbara, I had no idea who she was. She was there with Sheila Ortiz-Taylor on behalf of Fault Line, you know, that wonderful book. And she got up and talked about Naiad Press, and I told her that after the reading, I told her that I had this manuscript, and that's really how it all began. But you know, I had absolutely no idea, and I want to put this in context too for a lot of people who are tuning in who aren't aware of this history. I had no idea that she was affiliated with the Daughters of Bilitis, our very first lesbian organization. I had no idea that she had edited The Ladder, which was our national publication, and really fomented, you know, just the whole origins of lesbian writing. You know, so many of our writers began there, Jane Rule, you know, Lee Lynch. Anyway, just a whole raft of them. In fact, I would have to say that Sinister Wisdom is absolutely the heir to The Ladder. I mean, in terms of its importance to our community, it's just as legendary. It's featured just as many absolutely amazing, groundbreaking, important writers on so many issues that are important to so many facets of our community. So, you know, and in terms of what Naiad Press had published, there wasn't really that much in 1983. Even though the press had begun in 1973, they published probably a couple of dozen books. Certainly the work of Sarah Aldrich, who was Anita Marchand, who was one of the co-founders. Barbara, one of the books that they did publish in 1981 was Black Lesbians in Annotated Bibliography, for which you wrote the foreword. I'd love to hear more about that at some point. They had come out with The Lesbian in Literature, which was a complete, Barbara had compiled just this whole list of everything that was in print, and it was vanishingly small in the 80s. You know, I mean, little did I realize how much I had been in the forefront of, and everything that would just absolutely explode, you know, beyond that. And, you know, I just want to mention a few of the things that just happened during my tenure that I think are just amazing. She published the work, she republished all the books of Anne Bannon. She published Valerie Taylor, Randy Salem, March Hastings, Renee Vivian. She restored the 3 novels of Anne Allen Shockley to print. She published a book in association with Andrea Rice and Greta Schiller and the Before Stonewall film. She did Woman Plus Woman with Doris Claich. She did Staying Power, Long-Term Lesbian Couples by Susan Johnson. The Lesbian Periodicals Index. She published poetry by Claudia Scott and Sheila Taylor. She did Parents Matter, Parents' Relationships with Their Lesbian Daughters by Ann Muller. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, Parents Coming Out to Their Children. The Loving Lesbian, A Hot-Eyed Moderate, if you remember, by our great Jane Rule. Lesbian Crossroads, Happy Endings, Conversations with Lesbian Writers. Susan Johnson, For Love and for Life. And not to mention that she published Riverfinger Women, The Price of Salt. She did original novels by Jane Rule and Isabel Miller, and my great pride as an editor is that I edited 2 novels by Jane Rule and 2 novels by Isabel Miller. To this day, I'm so proud and so thrilled that I was able to work with those amazing writers. You know, and on top of that, she published literary fiction, she published mysteries, she published romance, she published essays, she published historical fiction, and she did all these reprints. Anyway, Barbara Greer and Donna McBride were just presided over something really, really special. And when I joined Naiad Press and Curious Wine came out in 1983. It was just a few months before Black, Lesbian, and White America. You know, I just felt like I've been shot out of the end of a cannon, and I had so much to do with the press. I edited so many writers, and you know, it was so hard. It was so hard back in those days because, you know, I don't think anybody appreciates, except maybe Joan, you and I, were only a year apart, how hard it was to write, you know, and what courage it took. It was to come out in those days for a lot of us. It was like walking into a fire. And the manuscripts that came in the door, I mean, we published what we could, but boy, there wasn't much, not like today. So anyway, I'm sorry for the lengthy ramble, but I'm very proud of this press, and I think what they accomplished was amazing. And I think the woman who was the energizer and the catalyst of all of it is just one of the most remarkable women who has ever walked among us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Katherine. I love hearing it, though. As a publisher, it makes me a little exhausted to think about all of that work.
They only worked 18 hours a day, Julie.
They worked a lot, I know. Dr. Clarke, how would you like to open us?
I'm opening? I thought Katherine opened.
Katherine opened. Now this is your opening. Mini opening.
All right. I'll proceed. And I'm honored and happy to be here among many of my old friends. So I'm calling my piece In Search of a Lesbian Feminist Audience. Feminist in parentheses. From early on, I knew I wanted to write and to publish. I wanted to write for. So lesbianism for me is about choosing to love women and the probability of gaining an audience. So my history with lesbianism is about getting the lesbian good news out there and producing a literature. Grabbing onto those means was crucial. So I found myself at a lucky historical intersection of lesbian publishing, writing, producing, publishing. Like most poets, I self-published my first book, Narratives, Poems in the Tradition of Black Women. The subtitle is meant to signal a literary, heritage and its audience. Because I was on the Conditions Collective, I came to understand and learn so much about the material production of a book. In this case, it was a production of 3,000 copies of 180 to 200 page magazine of journal proportions once a year. Then there was receiving and distributing the books. I was part of a community committed to creating an out literature by, about, for lesbian audiences. We had learned from the Black arts movement and the women's liberation movement how to create and control our literature. My work, or my desire as a writer, put me in good company with women like Barbara Smith and Nancy Bariano and Susan Sherman, and even today with women like Julie Enszer, but women who brought me into that lesbian community. When Barbara Smith was organizing the Black feminist retreats and creating Conditions 5, the Black women's issue, she invited me to write a review of Ntozake Shange's Nappy Edges. And from there on, I made my way among lesbians and in a world of lesbian publishing. Kitchen Table Women of Color Press first distributed and later published my first book, Narratives, and Firebrand Books, founded and directed by the indefatigable Nancy K. Bariano from 1984 to 1995, published, luckily for me, 3 of my books of poetry. Incidentally, as Julie Enszer noted, Firebrand Books office in Ithaca, New York, already a feature of the LGBT history tour there, has been designated as a historic landmark in Ithaca. Then there was This Bridge Called My Back and Homegirls, both producing the writing of lesbians of color for lesbian audiences, and studying the convergences of Black lesbian feminism and Black arts through the work of Audre Lorde is my life's work. And reaching back 45 years ago, 2 years ago, I self-published my chapbook, Targets, with a social justice collective here in my town in the Catskills. And I am rounding out my publishing life in Hobart, New York, the Book Village of the Catskills, with my partner who owns one of 8 bookstores here. But my whole life has been small, independent presses. And thank goodness for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clarke. Joan. Joan is muted.
Is she?
I know it might be hard to believe, but I am. I can be muted. To recognize that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. The unceded lands always was, always will be, and to pay respect to their elders past and present. When you change hemispheres, when you change skies, you change histories, but sadly, some histories never change. The history of occupation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm here, first I want to say that the archives, the Lesbian History Archives, was honored to be asked to be part of this. And I'm here to represent all the hard workers and have kept this place of memory going now almost 50 years. But why did we begin? And here I'm just going to go back a little further, since I bridge what we used to call the shadowy world, I bridge the bar cultures of the 50s. So I bridge a time of what I used to call a kind of deprivation. The archives, and there's a sentence I've carried with me my whole life, but I started reading from teaching my Sikh students in the 1960s, the colonized are condemned to lose their memory. Now, what does this have to, I'm not a publisher. I am part of a movement, a grassroots movement that said memory must be started now. That what is the plenitude, the going from deprivation of imaginative expressions, of a fullness, a sense of what we had a right to have in life, to plenitude. And why? Because we saw all these publications coming in all the publishers, as you have mentioned, and we wanted there to be a place where their history could be preserved. And in preparing for this, I was reading, Barbara, I was reading so much of what you've written over the years. In your introduction, in the back, so I'm still an archivist, even though I'm so far away. 26 years ago, I had to decide what books did I need to cross the oceans with. So these are my old copies. So, and in Black Lesbians, you wrote at the end, there is similarly no guarantee that we or our movement will survive long enough to become safely historical. I'm here not, as I said, as a publisher. I owe my writing life to Nancy Beriano, who took she took a risk because I wrote sex, I wrote openings, I wrote things that were not always comfortable in lesbian feminist times. And she published A Restricted Country. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be existing as a writer in any way if that hadn't happened. I just want to show you some of the other things I've brought with me. So Conditions 1 that just got that has been recognized, and then this incredible book. So these are not, some of these are Naiad Press books. This is Kitchen Table Press. So I can't, when you have to choose what to put in a barrel that's going to travel around the world, this is what I chose, Barbara. And I have to say, to be with you, I still remember the time we were at the first I'm going to get it all mixed up, but in Kansas City, do you remember the first Women's History Conference? It wasn't history, what was it called? The National
National Women's Studies Association.
Yeah, do you remember?
Yes, I remember it well.
Yes, and Deb and I, and then this book from Naiad, The Sex Variant. So, because I want to speak here in a way, or be a presence here of a bridge between the times when perhaps as a people we were not as articulate. My bar community, which lived in its body, was policed in its body, also had stories and poems and to tell, and what telling them under the shadow of the Women's House of Detention. There's a gritty beginning is what I'm trying to say. And then to come into what the 60s brought us, and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And I've listed things, because all the memories come flooding back, because it wasn't just the books, it was the newsletters. It was these fragile, mimeographed and stapled things that you all made into solidified culture. And then I'm just going to end by saying, but now I worry again. Because we thought, while we celebrate the fullness, in some ways, the forces that do not want us to speak, and all our differences, are gaining strength. And I worry about fascism.
Thank you, Joan. Always bringing the F word. Dr. Allen.
Well, I'm just happy to be here. I'm just going to say that. I'm going to start by that. By saying that I am so excited and so honored to be in this space with my Black lesbian literary foremothers, is what I call you, particularly Barbara Smith and Cheryl Clarke. And so, Joan, you mentioned that quote from Black Lesbians, and I have my copy here too. And the end of that phrase, if I'm remembering correctly, is we must document ourselves now. And that is the beginning of the title of my book that I'm writing about Black lesbian literary culture and history. And so, because I was not around, well, wasn't publishing, I was, pretty young when you all started. But my research is focused on partly on that era, and so how I came to Naiad Press was doing research looking for Black lesbian writing, and I will say that I did not find much, in some spaces. What I did find was life-changing. I found Conditions 5. This is my copy of that. I think I can show it to you, which again, Barbara Smith and Lorraine Bethel, life-changing for me. Homegirls, which I teach in all of my Black feminist seminars, life-changing. And I was telling someone just recently, I start every single class, no matter what it is, with a come by here with a collective statement, because that's my positionality. That is my framework for the work that I do, for who I am as a Black lesbian feminist, as well as what I want students to know about our history of organizing, as well as the frameworks that we use now, but often don't give credit to in the way that we do what we do now in terms of, theory and feminism and so on. So for me, Naiad is important because it is a beginning for some Black lesbian writers, but it's also, for me, not the space where I found community or where I found myself. I found that with Kitchen Table, and so part of my work at BLF Press then has been to extend that work, and so you mentioned Joan fascism and the ways in which, we're not being disappeared at this point, but I think the way our work has been invisibilized still, and the ways in which we are under attack and always have been. But so my work then is to make sure that Black lesbian voices are still heard. We are hetero-friendly, but for the most part, our work is centered on Black lesbian writers, Black women writers, and that is the work that I have been doing now since 2014. We are a small Black feminist independent press, which means that, some of you may not know who we are, and that's okay, because I think that the work has to be done regardless of visibility. I think, over the years, there's been a trajectory of lesbian publishing, so that now we can honor you, but what I also want us to be able to do is to keep doing that work. It's still necessary, it's still important. Our identities matter, our literature matters, our culture matters, and our histories matter. And so, again, I'm just happy to be here with y'all because I know that this group of women has impacted my work in so many ways. And I want to make sure that everybody that I know understands the importance of what you all have done and what you've contributed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, and a beautiful tee up for Barbara Smith.
Thank you so much. This is so incredible to be with all of you, and including people all over this screen and all over this world who think that this is something that they want to know more about. That is lesbian feminist publishing. I did a tweet this afternoon and I talked about it as the, what did I say? Not the golden age, but the golden something of lesbian feminist publishing. That's what we'd be talking about. I also said I would be spilling some tea. But I'm going to try to be better than that, at least for a little while. And there are just a couple of things I want to say about like motivations for the work that I have been involved in. It's so wonderful to hear those around our table, this table, that's on screen. To hear you mention work that I was involved in and created. Kitchen Table Women of Color Press began as a conversation between Audre Lorde and me. Audre was a friend of mine by that time. We had met in the late 1970s, and she was coming to Boston, where I lived, to do a Black women's poetry reading on Halloween. And it was 1980. And that Black women's poetry reading, several of the poets were coming from New York, including Audre. It was organized by a white gay man named Clover, who I think Clover Chango, Chango. And Clover, I think, identified as a fairy, and he loved Black women. And we were just in it together. He was really, really close to Hattie Gossett. So yeah, people think that they invented everything and everybody, was at each other's throats, never talked to each other. They just don't know. I saw a wonderful comment from a dear friend of mine, Nancy Wexler, who still lives in the Boston area and actually in Cambridge. Hi, Nancy. And she wrote that the reason she, I think, moved to Boston was because of gay community news. I mean, you just don't know what life is if you haven't lived in a town that was publishing a national left-wing lesbian and gay publication. I'm using the terminology of the time. It was not LGBTQIA+. It was a lesbian and gay publication. We persuaded during that era to get gay men to start saying, not only to use the word lesbian, but to put lesbian first. So it wasn't gay and lesbian. You could tell how progressive someone was by whether they put lesbian first before gay. But in any event, and that was a weekly newspaper, weekly, it came out every week. But in any event, Audrey and I were talking, just preparing for her visit, and she said, and that this inimitable voice of hers that was so, to me, inflected by her Caribbean roots, although of course she was born and grew up in New York. She said, Barbara, she said, we really need to do something about publishing. And my response was not hell yeah, but it was basically hell yeah, because I absolutely understood what she was saying, because both of us had been by that time involved with feminist publishing. Often feminist publishing was indeed created and kept alive by lesbians. We built all kinds of institutions during that time, which most people, or many people who are queer now, don't even know existed. That you had women's bookstores in every city, major and minor, and smaller and bigger cities. It's just a whole different way of life and time. And against such odds, because we were so embattled and we were so vilified. The fact that this panel is coming out of Florida, wow, and I said that, I think I said that to Michael when we talked. It's just really incredible. The more things change, the more they stay the same. But we were warriors, we were fighters. Audrey described herself as a warrior. So I said I could get together a meeting that weekend that they were going to be in Boston. And we met at my house in Roxbury, which is the counterpart to Harlem, or other Black, predominantly Black, predominantly Black neighborhoods because of gentrification. I don't know if we have Black neighborhoods anymore, but be that as it may, that was the first meeting of Kitchen Table Women of Color Press in October of 1980. We officially founded a year later, and we announced our existence at one of the Women in Print conferences. This one was one that happened in Maryland. We were meeting at the YMCA. They had a building in Maryland, a conference center, and that's where we were. And of course, there was no internet, there were no fax machines. And because of the fact that we announced our existence at the Women in Print conference, it was like sending out a press release using contemporary means to get the word out. It was perfect, in other words, because that news, the publishers were from all over the country. That news swept the country because, or at least the lesbian and feminist country, because of the fact that there were also newspaper and periodical publishers at that conference as well. There's a picture that many of you have probably seen. It's of Audrey, Sharima Raga, Hattie Gossett, and me in Kitchen Table Women of Color Press t-shirts. And that was taken, I'm pretty sure that was taken at that Women in Print conference. Two things when I talk about Kitchen Table that made it unique is that we were a press that had high literary standards. And that's the kind of publishing we did. That's why our books are still on shelves and republished by university presses, because we had really high literary standards, and that had a lot to do with the people who founded it. I mean, Audrey, Cherie, me. I mean, how low were they going to go? They weren't going to go very low. And then we also were a totally political press, a press on the left. And that was a very unique combination. within a context of lesbian, gay publishing, feminist publishing, because there is not a complete intersection between being what we now would say is queer and being even progressive. I mean, an identity is not a politic, and we had the politics. We came out of the movement to end the war in Vietnam. We came out of the Panthers, of the civil rights struggle. Very, very different than what we see now being defined as political work. There's only so much you can do on social media platforms. You have to be in the street and you have to be meeting people where they live. But be that as it may, those are the things that those two things are, I think, are what really made Kitchen Table unique. And the other thing, so it's three things, I guess. The other thing is that we decided to be a press for all women of color at the very beginning. It was 1980, and we decided that we were going to be a press for all women of color. People call to this day, they call Kitchen Table a Black women's press, a Black feminist press. It was not a Black women's press or a Black feminist press. There were Black feminists involved with Kitchen Table Women of Color Press we conceived of it, we implemented it, we took the boxes to the post office. I mean, we did the work. But the thing is, like, we saw ourselves at that moment in 1980 as being a press for all women of color. And we had some of the most fascinating conversations I've ever been involved in when we were first starting. These are conversations that happened in New York in like 1981, probably fall of 81, when we were trying to figure out who were indeed women of color, because we were quite aware that, for example, there were Latinas in South America whose ancestors and families had emigrated from Europe, escaping the Holocaust. So they were actually of European heritage, living in South America and speaking Spanish and being born in those countries. So do they get to qualify? So this is what we came up with. We decided that a woman of color, we weren't asking for photographs to be sent. It was not about appearance. It was what we decided was that any person who identified as with the indigenous people of her land qualified as a woman of color. So that doesn't mean that we were running around publishing white women, European identified white women. We were not, but we had such a complex definition of who women of color were. And I love what Stephanie said about being hetero-friendly. We were hetero-friendly too, because I saw our target audience as not the women's movement and the feminist community and the lesbian gay community. I didn't see that as our target audience. To me, our target audience was people of color, because that's where we wanted to dig in and do the work, the intellectual work, the ideological work, the turning over of apple cart's work, to get our home communities to realize that you didn't have to be heterosexual in order to be a valuable member of that community. So if there was a Latin American book fair, if there was an Asian American book fair, all of those kinds of things, we prioritized that. And we, of course, we did all the other things, that connected us to the women in print movement and to lesbian feminist publishing. But at the end of the day, those were my perspectives and my politics. And since I was left holding the bag pretty much, by, the mid 80s, it was like I said, it went the way I wanted it to go. So, like if it was a choice between, are we going to go to, say, Michigan, the Women's Music Festival in Michigan to sell books? Or are we going to go to a National Black Writers Conference at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn? You know where we went. We went to Medgar Evers. So that's all I have to say for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. I'm going to ask the next question and kind of tweak it from what I communicated originally. I had asked the panel to next reflect a little bit on what animated their work in this period. And what I want to ask, just sharpen that a little bit and ask if you might each share one challenge and one joy from your publishing or activist work. And part, as you're all thinking about it, part of what prompts me in thinking about this is this dual connection that you all are talking about, work, publishing work done in this period between broadly 1975 and 2000. And I see the people in the chat are loving on it, lighting up. It's a real touchstone and profoundly meaningful and filled with joy. And also there are these struggles that you each touched on briefly, but I wonder if you might just expand a little bit. One joy and one challenge or struggle related to your publishing or activism work.
We're not going in order anymore, so I'm going to be terrible and reply. The clock is ticking on us. The biggest challenge was racism in the context of the women's movement and in the context of the lesbian and gay movement. And again, I'm using the terminology of the time, and also and specifically in the context of the women in print movement. I almost did not do this panel because it focused on Naiad. And I have had such haunting, that's a nice word, I've had such haunting experiences dealing with people who, I don't have to say the names, but the thing is that it was very, very painful. I brought a book over to my desk to show to you, which is ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. 40 years of movement building with Barbara Smith. It's published by SUNY Press, and there's a whole section. It's basically a very interesting combination of interviews and also some of my writing, things that were published elsewhere. It's a unique book in how it's organized, but it was an attempt to kind of capture all the kinds of work that I've done in various areas. And there's a whole section about Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press. And one of the things in this book, if you're not familiar with it, is called Packing Boxes and Editing Manuscripts, Women of Color and Feminist Publishing. And it was published in Sojourner. And we did this dialogue with a group of women of color, by no means all of them affiliated with Kitchen Table, after a particularly bitter Women in Print meeting at the American Booksellers Association convention, because there was always a gathering of the women's presses before that convention started every year. And it was the worst thing that we did every year for us at Kitchen Table. It was just horrible. And one of the reasons, and the reason it was so horrible, is because of all the racism that we experienced, including from the people being honored here with the exhibit. I don't generally talk like this, but since we're trying to be historically accurate, I do have to say what happened. And so that was the hardest part. And then the joy for me was going to get the mail, or having other people who worked with me at Kitchen Table to bring the mail and to see the postmarks and the stamps from other nations. People writing to us from all over the world. I was particularly excited when we would hear from people in Asian countries, because of course, the writing is different, just the postmarks. It was just like, how far away, is this work going? And I used to say about our books, because of course, again, before the internet, I used to say our books go wherever people are able to read in English. And that's basically because of imperialism and colonialism. That's like basically the globe. And so we would hear, using that very, very Luddite technology called a letter, we would hear from people, and I just loved it. I loved it because it just showed that the work was getting where it needed to go.
Well, my comments kind of dovetails with, did you want? Okay. My comments kind of dovetail with Barbara's as well in terms of the biggest challenge that we face now. I'm not sure that it's much different from Barbara's. I'm not sure, in the sense that some of the most extreme racism that we've experienced as a press, when we've gone to conferences, has been by white lesbian writers and folks in publishing. So I don't know that this changed as much. I do think that there are things that are better. We don't necessarily have to go there, and I've never been back. But I do think we struggle with racism, as well as, the notion that lesbian, writing doesn't matter as much as it used to. There's a sense that, we're beyond that. We're beyond that, and we're beyond, these women's experiences. And it's not true. We know that it's not. So I think we struggle with that. The other thing I will share, since we're sharing, is that there are lots of Black writing organizations that don't support small presses, and they certainly don't support small queer presses, so I think that that's also a problem, that those are folks who are maintaining the status quo as opposed to supporting independent small feminist presses, and so I think those are our biggest challenges in, just getting people's attention. I think the work has been quality work. I think we've gotten some of the same, nominations and star book reviews as other folks, but we don't get the same kind of visibility, and so the folks who are here who do that type of work should pay attention to why they don't pay attention to us, not just BLF Press, specifically, but other small presses who are doing similar work. The biggest joy for me, it's been publishing my Black lesbian literary form, Mother Jill Gomez. I'm just gonna say it. Just being on this panel with Barbara Smith and Cheryl Clarke, and even Joan Nestle, whose book I've read, as well. But just thinking about the fact that we get to see our books out in the world, and like Barbara, we get emails, and I can see where our books are being sold, so Japan and Brazil and, in London, just all over the globe, and that brings me joy because people will email me from all over to say, we're so excited about your work, what are y'all doing next, and so I think that to be in conversation and concert with folks who've been doing this work for years, brings me joy, knowing that, I can talk to the people who I've read and who've impacted my life and my work, as well as, publishing the books that I want to read, and I think that's also important, not worrying about trends or fads or what we think the public wants, but the books that bring us joy and that give us life, and so that is why I do this work, because nobody goes into small press publishing to get rich. Nobody does. We do it because the books are important, because they need to be in the world, and that's why I do this work.
Barbara, if I might add here, just there's no way that I can speak to your experience. Obviously, I can only be, I'm only aware of my experience as senior editor at Naiad for 12 years, and also as editor of Penny Mickleberry and Nikki Baker. And my whole experience beginning in 1983 was Naiad Press published whatever we could get our hands on. I mean, that was kind of my experience, and it was hard to get work from anybody in that day and age. When I wrote my novel Curious Mind in 1982, which that's probably the joy of my life, as long as we're on that topic. I had no idea about being able to publish it. As far as I knew, nobody in America wanted to publish the damn book, and so I wrote the book for myself. I wrote the book that I wanted to read because I had read everything out there. I mean, we were living in a wasteland in terms of lesbian readership back in those days. I mean, the lesbian literature, let's face it, was a book about yay wide and full of photographs. You know, there was just nothing that we could find. And Naiad Press hadn't even published that much when I was with them. But and it was hard to get material. And some of the books that were sent to me to edit, there were years with Naiad when I was more like a battlefield surgeon than an editor, and it's hard to write. It's, you know, I have been so fortunate in my lifetime, and a lot of successful writers. I might point out that Nikki Baker, for one, came out of the world of finance. Penny Mickleberry was kind of a star reporter on the Washington, D.C. All I'm saying is that these were successful women who had the wherewithal and the time to write, but so many of us didn't. You know, and there was also just the pressures on our life. And far be it from me to speak about anything to the Black community, but just from where I sat, it just seemed to me to come out was an act of courage that was eons above what white people experienced, because there was so much cultural pressure in the Black community. Again, this is just my observation. I could be very, very wrong. You know, so I can only speak to what I saw, but we just cheered when we got a manuscript in that we could get our mitts on and that we could publish. You know, and then other presses came into existence. Firebrand was a godsend, you know, just in terms of and there was Seal Press and New Victoria and Antloot and Spinsters Inc. And all of a sudden there were other outlets, and to some degree, all of you incredible women on this panel, you just made all this possible. You inspired, all of a sudden people started writing. And look at today. I mean, look at today. I get this feed from Bella Books of, you know, this month's publications. It's like 50 books. You know, I mean, it's just, it's extraordinary. And anyway, you know, let me just read something from that Donna McBride sent to me just a few days ago, because we were kind of back and forth about different things. And anyway, she said, Naiad Press was serious about reaching those women lost in a world that hated them. Naiad's publishing was to give them something that made them feel good about themselves. And you know, I'm sure there were failures on many fronts and in many ways, but you know, we change and we grow, hopefully, and nobody knows better than I do how abrasive and difficult to work with Barbara Greer could be. Believe me, I've still got a few wounds of my own that have had to heal over the years, but the whole era was just amazing, and everything that everybody did was just amazing. Joan, I just want to, you know, point out that we are in the realm of the imagination and books and everything, but you, thank God for you, because you've got our tangible lives. You've got all of the, you've got the evidence. You've got the things that are not in books that so impact your lesbian history archives. Thank you for doing that. I mean, what a wonderful thing that you know, our archives are, and just in terms of preserving things about our lives. And there's so much history, and it's amazing history, good, bad, well, and there's nothing indifferent for sure. So anyway, somebody
Thank you.
else.
Joan or Cheryl, do you want to weigh in on a joy and challenge?
Well, for me, joy was Conditions magazine, and some of you may know that Sinister Wisdom did a special issue on Conditions back, well, this year. But I'll just read What I said about conditions from this issue, conditions was for me a defining moment. I had to learn new politics, new skills, new competencies to turn out annually the premier lesbian feminist journal, Conditions Was. I couldn't look at my own writing or my own self the same again, nor anyone else's writing that I would ever read. A life-changing, never been the same since experience. The exponential impact of 3,000 books a year, whether subscriptions or distribution in bookstores, academic institutions, prisons, mental institutions, at public events, cannot be gainsaid. Conditions was my first all lesbian experience. So Conditions was a joy for me and still is. The downside of everything when we're in our world is having to raise money for what we want to do. And that's still very hard and very difficult.
Okay. Oh, am I okay? Okay. I would say the greatest joy, in one sense, the greatest challenge, and this is, remember, I like the archives is the place where you all are, the past and the present, Stephanie, cherished in our lesbian queer setting. My greatest joy was the grassroots collectivity of the impossible work we did. You can't have an archives in an apartment. You don't have humidity control. Who ever heard? You're not trained. It just went all the nose, just like in publish, they just went on. But our recognition, and I want to speak for the women back in my other home, who walk the boards of the archives every day still, who sit around that old wooden table that used to be in 13A and keep this cultural loving heart growing with the complexities of our new times, connecting with the fierce, and that's what Barbara, when I see you and I hear you, the fierce courage, your fierce determination to let no one off the hook. I remember your early work about racism in the Jewish community and anti-Semitism in the Black community. Nobody else was saying those things because you were fierce in your perceptions and your love. And I say, if you have an opportunity to be part of a grassroots, a collective undertaking, do it. It will inform your soul for the rest of your life. And you may not think it's spiritual to lick 1,000 envelopes with other people, but it is. And it's all political. It's all political. And then so the biggest, and I just came, so much is coming, but I don't know if you remember Cheryl and Barbara, if you had some of you in town, but we would have these at homes at that apartment. Do you remember? I can still see Audrey standing under the arch of one of the rooms, and we'd have hundreds in an apartment, and it would be for cultural workers to present their work. So it would be readings from your presses. It would be the authors who would come. And sometimes we'd have so many people, we'd have to say, okay, we'll do a second showing. It was like, so there'd be a line. I mean, what I'm trying to say is when our collective passions, when our collective sense of what history has done and hasn't done, when our collective fierce refusal to be continued to be victims in some ways, and yet also not become collaborators with misuse of power, because it's so easy to confuse things. we change the world. And then the archives remembers. And we must have our rememberers, and I still believe in our own hands, in our own progressive hands, because archives have so often been just the chosen memory of power, right? Of national power. And I'll just end by saying, because the letters, like you're talking about for publishing, just a month ago in this new place that I've been for 20 years, I got a chance to meet with the youngest lesbian queer archives in the world, Indonesia, the Indonesian queer archives, and the woman who is doing the lesbian oral history work there. And their government is on the verge, perhaps, of making homosexuality a crime again. And I know I'm, but your words, the words that you made and are making, they're rivers of hope. They get to the places where they need to be. And we were laughed at as a grassroots archives. And we're still here because of the love of this community, the support of this community. And I just want to say, I saw that Sue O'Sullivan just signed on, and because I want to internationalize this, she of Sheba Press, you know, an interracial collective back in London in the 1980s. So, okay, that's all I'm going to say. But the joy is having known. Walked streets, sat on hills, sat in rooms with my friends Barbara and Cheryl.
Can I say something, please? I had to say something back to Jen. One of the things that I was thinking when you were talking is that when we met, I thought, I have never met anybody like Joan in my life. You are so unique. And I actually, after the Sinister Wisdom issue came out, and I read, you know, your piece, I think I can't remember, you can correct me, but like one of the pieces was, I think, a review you had done of, what was it, Brave? I can't remember what it was, but be that as it may, like I wrote to Julie, I said, I need to get Joan's email, and I have it. And you know I haven't used it because you know you did. Yeah, this is the first you know of me having your email. But I'll be using it, I hope, this evening after we get off. But the thing is that I've never met anybody like you, and I still haven't. You know, you're just incredible. And the thing is that I hung out at the Lesbian History Archives in your apartment. That's the first place it was. And I was there very near the beginning. And it was just so wonderful. I, of course, lived in Boston at that time, so I couldn't be there all the time. But one of the things, too, about where you were is that Woman Books was right on your corner. Yes, so it's just like, what is this? Like, it's like a lesbian feminist mecca over here. You know, it's like, go upstairs, you know, the Lesbian History Archives, and Deb and Joan are upstairs, and just looking at, because we were invisible. We were so invisible and so vilified, and then go downstairs, you know, and you know, go to the bookstore. One of the things I want to say, and people can, you know, agree or not agree with this, is that I feel like lesbians have been erased and are being erased. Nobody ever talks about lesbians anymore. I mean, I'm sure you could do a very easy media analysis project of how often does the word lesbian show up in, you know, however many publications, you know, you're checking.
I agree.
The word has virtually gone out of existence because other words have come into more common usage. But like when I introduced myself, I said, well, I'm actually a lesbian. I know you probably don't think that any of us are left, or you haven't heard of that group of people or whatever. But one of the things I always said that I liked about lesbian is because it did not mean anything else, except perhaps if you were a resident of the Isle of Lesbos. But other than if you lived on the Isle of Lesbos, it only meant one thing, you know, and I thought that was good for me. I wore lavender. It's not my favorite color by any means, but green is. But the thing is, I thought, let me pull out my lavender shirt, because I know young, you know, they would call themselves queer people. I have to explain to them what lavender is. I said, well, we had publications, a Lavender Menace, Lavender, I can't remember all the publication names, but there was a Lavender Menace, when, all that. They don't even know. So I thought, let me wear some lavender. We could go on and on, but I know we don't have all the time.
That's one of the major things that can be said about Naiad and about Barb Greer, is that, she was committed to lesbians. And you're right, Barbara. I think lesbians are very much erased from the cultural production of the last 40 years of
well, I think that we may all have disagreements about that, and that may be another subject of a panel, but I do want to keep our commitment. I worry about the people in the background at the museum thinking, how long will we keep this wonderful audience? So I am going to draw us to a close. Thank you all for joining us this evening, for sharing your great thoughts. I hope that people, I was going to ask this as a final question, but I will challenge it to audience members to think about what lessons you've heard from the stories this evening that you can bring forward and into your work in the world. The exhibition, It's a Lot Like Falling in Love, Legacies of Naiad Press and the Tallahassee Lesbian Community, is currently on view at the FSU Museum of Fine Arts. Please go visit it before it closes on October 29th. Listen to the oral history collections, which are available online, and look at the project site. I want to thank Michael Franklin and Rayanne for doing this work. Thank you to Annie Booth and the entire museum staff who's been here with us this evening and working in the background. Thank you to the event sponsors, the Lesbian History Archives, the Honors Program at Florida State University, and the Program on Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Florida State. Big heartfelt thank you to all of the panelists. You were all so riveting and wonderful in your comments. And thank you to everyone who joined this evening, including all of my Sinister Wisdom comrades. In about a week, you will receive an email from the museum with a link to the recording of this event, a link to the exhibits, and a link to the oral histories. Please look out for this in your email and check your spam if you don't see it. Thank you all again. And Annie, is there anything else you want to say before you end the call?
We just want to thank everyone for being here tonight and for the wonderful conversation. You'll be hearing from me in the museum within the next week with some follow-up on the things we were talking about, some of the books that were mentioned, and also links to the exhibition website and the recording of this event. Thank you so much for all of the people who participated in the chat. We were just so delighted and emotional seeing all of the conversation that was happening. And I want to thank each of our panelists as well for being here with us. And have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you.